just wanted to start off by thanking the e-Government Academy, the government of Estonia, for bringing all of us here together so that we can share our experiences. It's my first time here, so you can imagine I'll probably be the one person who will have the most takeaways after this, the two-day conference. But straight into the presentation, given that my time is already rolling. I wanted to quickly, my presentation is in about 3 segments. The first will give you really briefly Rwanda at a glance, for people who haven't been to Rwanda. Also to show you what our doing business landscape looks like, because e-government is a very specific aspect of our doing business landscape, as well as the digital transformation agenda, which is what we're talking about today. So quickly, Rwanda is a country of 12.7 million people. We have about 4 languages. The official ones are English, French, and Kinyarwanda, the local language. We have a literacy rate of 68%, as well as unemployment at 16%. But this is really basic literacy. When we talk about digital literacy, which I will touch on in my presentation, it's still very low. We are as low as 27%. Something else, well, it's a presidential republic. Our GDP per capita is $774, and we've been growing at a 7.5% per annum. And very specifically, because we're talking about the technology sector, the ICT sector in itself has been contributing 3% to the GDP of the country. Moving on, I just wanted to quickly show the holistic approach that we've taken as a country to really improve our doing business environment. We're the second fastest growing economy on the continent. A very young population, more than 60% of our population is in the youth bracket. In terms of low risk, low debt ratio, and I'll share these slides so I don't have to go through everything, just to give you a sense of what our doing business landscape is. Mainly because I know even in this room, we're not only speaking to policymakers, but we're also speaking to people from the industry, from the private sector, with whom we're looking to forge B2B type of partnerships with our very own companies. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the IT readiness of the economy, where we've been ranked the first in the world in terms of network readiness, and this was run by the World Economic Forum. We are the second in terms of ICT promotion, and we have an LTE coverage of 95%. 3G is at 97%. This is just coverage. When we come to penetration, and we'll talk about it later in the presentation, our mobile penetration is at 83%. Our internet penetration is at 52%. So I wanted to quickly take you through a journey that we started more than 20 years ago. As many of you know, the history of our country after the genocide against the Tutsis in 1994, we were really starting from a very low base. If anything, zero base, completely. All the infrastructure wasn't there, was non-existent. We didn't have institutions. But yet we understood that the biggest growth driver for our country was going to be our people, and technology was going to be one of the enabling aspects of really pushing growth of our country. And so we started on a 20-year strategy that is split into 4 5-year rolling plans. And the very first plan, which we call the NICI 1, by NICI we mean National Information Communication Infrastructure Strategy, really focused, because this was really in 2000, there's really nothing, focused on putting in place the enabling environment, putting in place the right institutional frameworks, the ministry through which I'm heading, the implementation, the agency that coordinates implementation across government. We have the CEO here within the audience, the regulatory authority, but also most importantly, because we had only one telecom company, we also had to think about liberalizing the telecom market so that we can increase competition. Moving on, after 5 years, we then had the NICI 2, which then focused on how do we put in place the building blocks of really transitioning from an heavily agricultural-based economy into a knowledge-based economy. And infrastructure had to be the initial building block for which we had to put in place. And so what I did was to give you a sense of some of the infrastructure facilities that we put in place. We had the national backbone that was put in place thanks to the support of the World Bank. We rolled out fiber infrastructure across the entire country, connecting all these 30 districts of the country and the border points. Then we had to put in place a data center because as you roll out infrastructure, as you put in services, there was a need that we were able to host our data. And of course, it meant that with this infrastructure and information online, we needed to think critically and deliberately about how do we safeguard our information assets, how do we safeguard our infrastructure assets, and that's why we invested heavily in cybersecurity infrastructure, the public key infrastructure, putting in place a cybersecurity response team, and all these are things that we needed to put in place as we thought about putting in place the enablers of infrastructure that were required. Another thing that we had to do was, since our digital literacy levels then were as low as 2%, was how do we put in place service access points that allow for citizens, especially in the rural areas, to be able to access and benefit from these digital solutions and services. So we have these kind of facilities spread across all our rural communities, almost similar to an internet cafe concept, broader in scope because we don't just provide computers and connectivity for people to just come in and sign in and request for a service or send an email, but also we're using them to become hubs where you have social innovators coming together and understanding what are some of the problems in their communities and how do they co-innovate together to create specific solutions for their communities. Then the third plan, which was from 2001 to 2015, now focused on us thinking about, now that we have the infrastructure in place, how do we leverage this so that we can drive digital transformation in the different sectors, whether it's in government, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in financial services, agriculture, because 70% of our population is involved in agricultural activities. So basically all the key sectors and segments of the economy, really being deliberate about thinking, how do we use technology as an enabler and a way to fast track how we achieve the objectives and intentions of the sectors. And here I just put out things that are very specific to e-government because I know that's really the meat of the discussion in these 2 days. But there's a whole long list of things that have been happening. But for this one, I think the key thing that we got was really thinking critically as a government and saying, how do we bring services closer to citizens? Do we start by making government more efficient, more productive, and eventually putting services online and making them closer to the citizens? Or do we start by having a front-end system that makes it easy for every citizen across the country to be able to go online, apply for a service, get their service, and then work backward to think about what kind of business process reengineering do we need to do? And so that's the choice that we chose because we felt like if we focus on business process engineering, making government more efficient and productive, maybe it will delay the process of making sure that the citizens are actually being served and given services and brought closer to them. And so it was a parallel effort where we built a front-end system. Today, when you go to that front-end system, you have about 94 critical services of government online. A citizen will go to it, apply for a service. So basically, the benefits have been that for the 4 to 5 trips that a citizen has had to take to a specific government institution to get a service, have now resulted into either no trip at all or at least one trip when you're going to receive your service. And I'll explain that a little bit later because what we did was more process mapping and then putting services online. So at least a citizen required to go to a government agency to just pick their service, but they didn't have to go to a government agency to understand the requirements, to apply, to track where the service, their request has reached. So they would get automatic notifications and would only visit a government office when they need to pick up a particular service they've applied for. And we'll talk about our next step as we go ahead. And then finally, where we are now is what we are calling the Nikki 4, but we're also calling it the Smart Rwanda Master Plan. That's why you see I call this 2.0, because this is going to be our next phase. And so what we've done again here was to think about things like e-procurement systems. Procurement is like the biggest hurdle any government has to face in terms of how stringent the processes are, but also the need to be transparent, the need to be efficient. And so we had to put in place an e-procurement system that allowed for government institutions to have a centralized platform that even suppliers would bid through and be able to provide a transparent way of managing this process. Then we had a unified IP-based communication system that allows us across government to communicate. What used to happen back in the day was that across all the 30 districts, if you had a meeting that involved grassroots level leaders, some of them would have to travel, maybe 2 hours, maybe 3 hours to come for a meeting. And so we're able to put in place video conferencing facilities at each of these offices. And so when a meeting has to happen, whether it's at central government connecting us to the local government officials, we just needed to connect through the video conferencing facility. And that really brought a lot of efficiencies in terms of just minimizing the hurdles of, and even the whole nuance around traveling for 3 hours just to attend a meeting and probably having to spend a night in a hotel because traveling back late in the night is not possible. And then we thought about the government command center. And I think this applies to many of the people who are seated in this room that are from the public sector. When you work with the Ministry of Finance and you have a whole long list of projects that the government is financing, how do you know where progress is for any specific project? I'm sure for many of us, we still have to make a phone call, write an email, send a letter requesting for progress updates. And so we realized that that was a very inefficient way of even improving decision making across government. Because if the Prime Minister has to call me to understand the status on a project X, by the time I respond, you're not getting the real-time value of having access to data. And so we had to put in place a government command center which had all the projects financed by government, the status, where they are at in terms of resourcing, in terms of projects. If there are any specific delays that are happening, then you have red flags coming up saying this project is actually delayed by a day or two. These are the challenges that it has, and this is how it can be unlocked. So it helped for many of the decision makers to be able to bring together the different partners that need to unlock some of the challenges so that we have a faster way of improving our decision-making process. And on a very practical level, when it came to citizens, because e-government is not just government to government, it's also government to citizens, it's also government to businesses. We had to work very closely with the private sector. And something I didn't mention, where we are today, a lot of it had been government investments. And so we started to think, why are we investing? Government has put in place the building blocks. How do we onboard the private sector to create some of these solutions? And many of these that you see are actually developed by the private sector. They sit with government and understand, what need are you trying to address for agriculture? Is it a question of market prices for agricultural produce? Is it a question that farmers are not directly linked to their suppliers for fertilizers? How do we create a system that allows for farmers to be able to request for fertilizers online, get the fertilizers, but also build in a credit facility that allows that over time, as you pay back for these fertilizers, you're able to even get micro loans from the banks. And so these are things that our private sector has really been instrumental in driving, understanding what are the needs that are all enshrined in our Smart Rwanda master plan that we are trying to address as a government. I delayed on this one, but I'm going to have to rush through this. I think we did talk about a lot of these things. Our digital transformation agenda is manifold. We're trying to make sure there's broadband for all. At the end of the day, this is the cornerstone of making sure that digital transformation is achieved. We're trying to make sure digital literacy is achieved, because if you're putting all these services, products, and solutions online, and your citizens are not able to even have the skills to go on a mobile device or a laptop and apply for a service. Even today, we've put in place stopgap measures like creating agency networks. But as the services get sophisticated, citizen information will be exposed. And that's why we work so hard to build their literacy levels so that we can make sure that citizens are able to transact on their own without support. We intend to achieve full service digitization by 2024, and of course, cybersecurity becomes a key element. I have to rush through most of this because of the time. This slide just shows all the type of policies we've had to put in place that really support our e-government agenda, which is very crucial from a public sector perspective to drive this agenda. The next one really shows you very briefly what are our next steps. Now that we have most of the services online, where are we going? The important one that I want to highlight is the smart administration system. It's a collaboration tool that brings together all government systems. It's going to have a centralized a consolidated directory for all government officials. So if I need an official in Ministry X, I'm able to know these are their contact details, this is how I reach them. Today, you'd still have to call someone that you know in an institution to give you these contact details. But also, most importantly, it gives us a harmonized emailing system, because we still have elements of where some of the officials, especially in local government, are still using their personal emails, Yahoo, Gmail, and so we're trying to create a more secure email system that allows for that. The other component that we have is around instant messaging. Today, if I'm trying to communicate even with the CEO who I work very closely with, sometimes I'll use BBM and WhatsApp and probably even share some documents depending on how quickly I want this to do. So we're trying to create a solution through government where, whether it's text, voice, or video, we're able to share in a secure manner government documents, as opposed to using some of these commercial solutions that are available. The other one that's crucial to explain is the government enterprise bus system. This is really going to be a system that consolidates all the different systems that are happening in the different sectors to allow for interoperability and information exchange. Today, you have many institutions that are trying to connect to the National Population Registry, which, if we had one enterprise service bus, there's one single place where you can connect, and you don't have multiple point-to-point type of connections, and you have a single point connection. The digital ID is something else that we're transitioning to. As Rwanda, we already have the first generation of ID system. We have a population registry with biometric data. And it also has an EID system, chip-based card, for those that want to use chips. But then we want to go to the next level of the next generation of ID systems, which is the digital ID. And finally, eRainbow 2.0, the platform I say that has all government services. We're trying to improve it by adding a business intelligence tool that allows for citizens to be able to look at this data. So a lot of this I've talked about, the smart administration, which has the government directly, email platform, digital signatures, project management system. So I'll not go through this because many of these I've already discussed, and will be happy to discuss with all of you. The enterprise service bus that we talked about, interconnecting all of the back-end systems as government that we are trying to digitize. The digital ID, like I already mentioned, we already have a national population registry in place with an EID system attached to it that gives you real-time identity checks that need to be done when you're applying for services, whether it's from the government side or even from the private sector side. And actually, something I need to mention here that's crucial is the cross-border mutual recognition. Within the East African region, all the countries that are bordering with us, we are able to support cross-border mutual recognition of our IDs, which has been a very huge milestone in terms of not necessitating for our citizens to all have passports if they just have to go to the neighboring countries. And I think as we get into this digital ID framework that we are trying to create for Rwanda, we have the Director General of Smart Africa here. The idea is that we create a framework for the entire continent with guidelines, with standards, and when each of the countries implements their digital ID, we can achieve this particular attribute. And I think this is the last one. We did talk about it. So thank you very much. I've run over my time, but I'll be more than happy to respond to questions.